Some students, when you ask about their cultural heritage, reply something like, "Oh, I'm nothing, I'm just American." Probably the people who can most accurately say this are the people who consider themselves Native American. Some other terms used these days to refer to Native Americans include like Indians or Indigenous people or even First Nations. We're going to start off our discussion of the many cultures of the United States with the cultures and people who were here first, the Native Americans. I want to introduce you to the concept of assimilation so we can discuss this issue related to some people who identify as Native Americans themselves in our country today. Soon in this unit, you will write your first post discussions about this. Okay, before we get started and get too far in, I want to make sure you downloaded your copy of the Terms for Talking About Identity. It's on the Module 1 Indian Country Learning Guide or Unit 1 Learning Guide. Now, as you have that, it's best to, well, you can either print out a copy or you can just use it on your, download the copy on your computer, and I want you to fill out the terms, definitions for the terms as we give them. And you're going to use this copy throughout the whole course. So make sure you save it on your computer and you keep a running list as we go through the different units. Now, as we start, I want you to take a look at the land that is North America, where we live now, and I want you to try to think about what you learned about this in high school. Okay, when I was in high school, it was old school, I learned that pretty much this continent was an empty space when the first Europeans sat here in the 15th century. So look at that empty space out there, that nice map. My impression was that the people that were here on this land when the first Europeans got here were few in number, pretty uninteresting culturally, and were mainly a nuisance as the English forged west to civilize the land by divvying it up out as private property in little parcels and giving them to individuals with land titles. So for the brave settlers for farming, which is the obvious vehicle for economic growth in their mindset. Take a minute to think about what you took away then from your high school history classes about the Native Americans. I hope it was more nuanced and accurate than my view. The truth is there were about 15 million people living in what's now the United States when the first Europeans got here. They were divided into hundreds of cultural groups and hundreds of languages. Further south in what's now Mexico, the Mexica had established the great city of Tenochtitlan with a population of about 200,000, which was comparable in size at the time to Paris and Naples, Italy. And they had the engineering know-how to build the city on a lake. They built it on top of a body of water. While the area that's now the United States had a smaller Native American cities, our continent obviously had a lot of people here and a lot of communities living in a lot of different ways. Okay, so where did all the Native Americans go? If you're a Native American, you might know the answer to this, and you're jumping up and down saying, "Here I am, we haven't gone anywhere." But just bear with me for a little bit. I want to talk about the deaths due to smallpox. 90% of the Native Americans died of smallpox, which was a disease that the Europeans brought over. They had immunity to, and the Native Americans did not. Now, this in no means to discount the fact that many Native Americans were just killed, assassinated by the Europeans, but it's the Europeans were helped in their desire to eliminate and kill Native Americans by the smallpox virus. I was trying to find, and I'm covered a little bit, I was trying to find a picture that wasn't too shocking of smallpox. Smallpox is a terrible, terrible disease. As you can see down the bottom right, what smallpox looks like. You can imagine someone's whole body covered in that. It's really horrifying. So where they are today. So again, here's the people. If you were jumping up and down saying, "We haven't gone anywhere, here we are." Here's some more images of people who identify as Native American. So you can see in the top, these are some women who live in Guatemala who probably, before identifying as Guatemalan, they probably identify with their indigenous group. This is in Chichicastenango, Guatemala. So they may identify as Maya Quiche, And then they might say, oh, yeah, and I'm Guatemalan. But the young people on the bottom who are from El Salvador, they might feel indigenous as well. So in what's now Mexico and Central America and South America, the Spanish conquistadors intermarried and had children with the Native Americans. While many people there speak Spanish now, many also continue to speak indigenous languages. So it's very likely that the ladies on top they probably speak Spanish, and they probably speak Maya Quiche as well. There's still over 20 indigenous language spoken just in Guatemala. There are lots of indigenous language spoken in Mexico, and there are indigenous languages spoken in the U.S. as well. And when we view a documentary, we'll see a little bit about the efforts to make sure that those languages don't go away. Now, in contrast to what the Spaniards do, the first English settlers to what's now the United States brought spouses with them, and they tended to marry only amongst themselves and avoided the indigenous population. So they tended to push the indigenous people onto land, force them onto land where they hadn't necessarily lived before, which was by no means the most desirable land. And in many cases, the indigenous people's ability to farm and just raise food for themselves was taken away, because when you've got crappy land, it's hard to grow food for yourself. Okay, here's a map where you can see the diverse group of peoples, all the different communities that existed in the North American continent at the time of the first contact. You can see all these different language families. In the upper right, you can see a map of language families. And keep in mind, families are groups of languages. So like Maya is a language family, and then there's like over 20 different Maya languages. There is a huge linguistic variety, huge cultural variety. Okay, today, some Americans who still identify as Native American live on land that the U.S. government recognizes as theirs still, or reservations. Reservations are supposed to be places where Native Americans can govern themselves and maintain their cultural ties to each other and to their past. In a basic way, a reservation is supposed to be like a country, like the Lakota or Creek Nation, that's found in the territory of another country, which would be the United States. So you can see where reservations are on the colored areas on the map. The stories of how the Native Americans' original countries were reduced to these little small pieces of territory. These stories are long, they're complicated, and in general implicate the European settlers, meaning they make them look really, really bad. As an optional exercise, you can read a really condensed version of what happened on the PBS website associated with the documentary that we'll see. We'll be watching that documentary later in the unit, so it's a good introduction. So many people who identify as Native American don't live on reservations, but like they live everywhere else. They live where everybody else lives. Some Native Americans living away from reservations still try to maintain their cultural identity, though. They want to speak a Native American language in their house. They maintain close contact with other members of their tribe and even members of related tribes. They may even participate in the politics of the reservation by voting or holding an office in the tribal government. Still other Native Americans assimilate into mainstream U.S. culture. So what does this mean? Here are some pictures of some Native Americans that have assimilated. Let's talk about assimilation. Okay, assimilation is a process. Now, this is on your list of terms for talking about identity, so get out your list. It's a process by which different groups come together and contribute more or less equally their cultural products, perspectives, and practices to create a new group. And this is the classical melting pot metaphor that's frequently used to describe our country. I know it was used a lot in my history classes. From this viewpoint, assimilation is benign. It's harmless, and at best, it's positive and inclusive, taking the best of each group to make a stronger combined group. So there it is, like a chocolate fondue that is our country right there in that picture. However, the issue is that assimilation in the United States has historically been one-sided and forced. It's been coerced. So historically, what happens isn't like a blending and melting so much as a process designed to impose languages and customs brought over from Great Britain in the early years of American society onto newcomers of the group. Some sociologists call this Anglo conformity. So newcomers, immigrants, are expected to abandon their cultural heritage if they want access to education and better jobs and the resources of our society. So in this unit, we'll be discussing how some people who consider themselves Native Americans deal with issues of assimilation today. Just want to point out some more terms that you'll hear. Pluralism is like an alternative to assimilation. And as early as 1915, Horace Kallen rejected the idea that people had to give up their cultural heritage to fully participate in American society. So he maintained that the presence of separate ethnic groups with their own languages, cultures, and even religions served democratic American values. It was good, in other words, for people to maintain their cultural heritage, maintain their language when they came to the United States. That was good for the country. In this model, the United States is like a cultural mosaic, or like maybe a little quilt, with each group living and working together without losing their identification as a group. One more term I just want to put on your radar, and that's multiculturalism. Discussing this in the United States today frequently uses the language of multiculturalism when we talk about diversity. And since the title of our course uses the expression cultural diversity in the United States, let's define what we're talking about. So one good definition of multiculturalism is a general term for a variety of programs and ideas that stress mutual respect for all groups and for the multiple heritages that have shaped the United States. During our class, we honestly could not begin to exhaustively examine all the cultural groups that live in our country today, and that's not one of our goals. That just can't be done in a class. Rather, we'll learn some tools for talking about these groups and how they interact and how they contribute to our society. You'll be able to use these tools to help you articulate who you are, and you'll also look at how some authors from the United States have negotiated their own identities in the literature they're going to write. So this is going to be good. The next thing I want you to do then is to go back to the learning guide for this unit, and you're going to start to see the documentary. As you view the documentary on a simulation, it's called A Seat at the Drum. As you view that, you'll have access to a quiz, and you should do the quiz as you view the documentary. So this is going to be fun.